Bum, 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 bum.
You're listening to Tove, a podcast about the good place and Jewish ideas. Hey everyone, thanks for being with us again. John Spirosavet and Dan Ross. Hey Dan.
Hi, John. Always a pleasure to talk about the good place and Jewish ideas with you.
Likewise. We're talking about Chapter 10, Chidi's Choice. I have to say, it goes to me a lot with the next one. Chapter 11 is What's My Motivation? I watched them kind of at the same time together. I think I can keep them straight because I wrote my notes down. So we'll try to confine ourselves to one episode. But this is a terrific span of episodes as we get toward the end of the first season.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a summary here?
I will. I'll go ahead and read it. So Michael tries to help Chidi choose between the two Eleanors, causing Chidi to flash back to his difficulties in life, making choices about everything, from choosing up teams during recess to fulfilling the responsibilities of being a best man. And we learn that Chidi's indecision is what led to his death. Eleanor and Tahani both profess their love for Chidi and decide to deal with their conflict by deepening their friendship and sharing their favorite activities with each other. Eleanor wonders if Jason is in fact her soulmate, but Jason falls in love with Janet. The greatest love story of all time. The two of them get married. Watching Jason try to feed Janet cake unsuccessfully, Eleanor and Tahani both decide that they are not in fact in love with Chidi, and Tahani tells Eleanor there might be another way to keep her in the good place.
So there is so many funny things in this episode.
Yeah. I mean, the wedding between Jason and Janet's absolutely classic.
I was thinking about that. I wanted to get this line right about Janet's vows. Jason, when I was rebooted and I lost all my knowledge, I was confused and disoriented, but you were always kind to me. And according to the central theme of 231,600 songs, movies, poems, and novels that I've researched for these vows in the last 3 seconds, that's what love's all about.
Yeah.
And then I think followed by that when while they were watching Jason try to feed wedding cake to Janet, who I guess doesn't eat, so that she doesn't know how to put food in her
Doesn't need
mouth.
the normal sustenance of human beings.
No, and there's actually one of my favorite midrashes has to do with these two. I'll stick it in the notes a little bit there.
Okay.
And I think it's was it Eleanor who said about Jason? I watched him eat electrical tape. Thinking it was
right.
like that fruit by the foot, the like disgusting fruit leather.
That's I mean, and one of my favorite things is the running gag. I can't remember if we've had it yet, when Jason just talks about being in love with a girl, and Janet always says, "Not a girl."
Well, I think this is actually the first time that comes up. And that horrible thing at the beginning when this episode just jumps right into fun where I think they're in the what's it called, the bud hole in Jason's
right,
and and something about the poster with Ariana Grande and something about like being in love with her but wanting to be, I don't know, like
a really crass description of love, as I recall correctly.
Also, like being wanting to be her to be like his sister or something.
Yeah.
And there at the beginning, I think where Tahani says it would be one thing if that you're not a Buddhist monk, but you're barely even a regular functioning person.
The way that this show treats Jacksonville in Florida is
Dan, are there some kids outside your window?
There are nursery school kids. Yes.
Cool. Yeah.
Portals. And now Trevor Lawrence. Oh my God, I can't even imagine what would happen if we still had the good place with the Jaguars having drafted the most promising quarterback prospect of the past decade. I'm pretty sure that Jason is resting in peace these days.
That's good. That's good. Trevor. Yeah. We already have a Trevor in the good place, and it's not good.
Oh, he is not good. That's saying something.
You and I haven't talked about Trevor.
No, I guess we haven't talked about Trevor. He is the embodiment of everything obnoxious and loathsome in this world.
I'm glad you said obnoxious. I was trying to put my finger on what it was in talking to, I think in the last couple of episodes here of the podcast, we're talking about Trevor and just what it is about him that pushes my buttons in addition to his obviously being evil. Obviously, this is a classic episode in terms of the flashbacks around Chidi's indecision, and I love the thing on the at the recess field with the who he should pick, and his going through all the things. Should he pick the girl because of gender politics, or is that pandering or my limited male point of view? And then little playground Chidi says, I am vexed, and his friend, who turns out to be the guy who he's the best friends later with, the best man thing, always, you're always vexed. And then when the bell rings at the end, he says, Chidi, you have filibustered recess.
It's unsurprising that Chidi would move in circles when he was younger that used pretty serious words for elementary schoolers. I don't know somebody who would use vexed and filibustered in that way, but seems apropos. right on brand.
Oh my goodness, there was so much. The writers were super on in this episode.
So I loved the scene where he's sitting down with his friend trying to write the best man speech, and you were feeling so bad for this poor person sitting on the couch, and then you realize it's a total farce, and he says, I'm getting married in a month. I lied to you about the date so I could prove to you that you can't be my best man. I mean, so tell me, I think that both of us really talked about resonating with Chidi. You would ask, like, which character do you feel most akin to? So how does Chidi's indecision manifest, if that's at all something that's part of your ongoing story?
Think about this out loud. What's, I think, troubling me, actually, now that you asked me that question, is that I think Chidi also stands for the idea that if you take principles and try to think them through with any decision in front of you, you can lead to indecision. And he has moral principles. He's really not quite sure what the soccer, situation, just how many reverberations there might be and consequences, and mostly because you can't know what all the consequences are. And so if you're really trying to figure out how a decision is going to affect your future good character, or how it's going to affect people you don't know down the line, then of course that those good principles could totally paralyze you, and which makes me doubt the value of having these principles and trying to use them to make decisions. Boy, in terms of I guess it's more the question of what makes me feel indecisive. What are the points at which I'm not sure what to do? I think that one thing that comes to me just in public related civic life is thinking about the power of being able to teach and be persuasive to people versus being curious and listening and open-minded. And I'm often torn between those two things, whether I'm selling out one by doing the other.
That's really interesting. And what you just brought up sort of makes me think about Chidi's approach to decision making, which is actually very externally focused when you think about it. He's largely talking about how he's going to be perceived by other people as he weighs the consequences of his decision. It's not how is this going to affect me, my soul, my well-being. It's all about, whether people will see me as a misogynist or pandering or whatever, or whether or not I'll be able to, give a best man speech that honors my friend sufficiently. And I'm not saying, there's obviously virtue in his sort of self-annihilation of his ego and thinking about other people. And at the same time, you wonder when he's sitting around. This is the episode where he sits and talks to, I can't remember who he's talking to, and he's trying to make a decision between the women. And somebody tells him, go with that, Eleanor. And then he says, well, and he says, no. When I said that, you had a thought, whether it was right or wrong. Just not being able to listen to that voice and think about your own needs, which is important. I mean, it's certainly not unimportant. It's obviously valuable to be considerate of others, as per Janet's wedding vows, right? Like that's the lesson of love, what love is about. And at the same time, you wonder what Chidi is actually what Chidi wants, for himself, just for himself. I guess you could say that he wants to be well regarded more than anything else.
That's interesting because I thought when I was talking in the previous episode to Rebecca about lying, there was a point where Chidi just says like, I can't be a person who lies. Like that's not who I am.
Hmm.
And he kind of it's the one, it's very not consequentialist. It's not about, if I lie, I might hurt this person's feelings in that way, which I think he also thinks about at times. But that it's a kind of refreshingly just self-contained in there. And I think where Chidi has indecision is where he thinks of himself as having allegiances in all kinds of places, to his own integrity, to his best man, to all the people who might have made the soup or the air conditioner.
Right.
And so yeah, trying to and maybe that's what it is too, like trying to locate myself as like what's my special gift in this situation, and trying to center that may be something I forget to do, or I don't know so much to do. How about
Mhm.
you? Do you have this cheatiness in you?
Absolutely. I'm surely a ruminator, and double, question decisions over and over and over again, and think 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, all of the imaginable consequences of anything that I do. So I am well accustomed to the paralytic indecision that GD experiences. And I think I to a certain extent, I wonder. I think it was George W. Bush's memoir called "Decision Points," and like he used to talk about himself as the decider.
Mhm.
And I think that I wonder, just because his presidency was at such a formative years in my life, that I kind of like distanced myself, naturally saw, well, that is not something that I want to be, right? I don't want to be, an inconsiderate decider. I want to be somebody who thinks and is thoughtful, and makes choices based off of considerable evidence and reflection. So I don't know if that actually is a what that psychosocial analysis of myself is, but I definitely remember thinking like, okay, so that's what the president's it's not about being reflective and thoughtful. And granted, the decisions that are made in that office are important, and the decisions that all of us make are obviously important. And at the same time, I think I similarly find a value in really thinking through. Um,
It's interesting. I think the episode sets up choices as here, not choices usually between a good and a bad thing. And usually when we teach, I think, and the rhetoric of choice is good choices, bad choices. But all of these things, everything from rock, scissors, paper, which I believe Michael criticizes him for, yeah, it's saying he can't decide because it's too many variables, and or should he use a dry erase board to even like write down his pros and cons, or should he use pen and paper? Like even like there's literally nothing that he can't think of as being susceptible to a choice, and
there's a book that came out recently by an author that I can remember is Daniel Kahneman, but there's a couple of other authors, called Noise, and it's a flaw in human judgment is what they talk about. And it's just the ways that we set ourselves up through various factors that kind of cloud our judgment, that cause us to make poor decisions. And one of the things that they argue for is like, you really should judge a decision that you make on the process by which you came to that decision, as opposed to on the outcome of that decision. So thinking about like, do I have the right setup? They call it decision hygiene.
interesting.
Do I have the right infrastructure? Is the way that I'm approaching decision making healthy and honest? Of course, based off of enlightenment values backed by data.
Well,
So
that's interesting because that is the thing Chidi can't do. He cannot give himself over to any process without questioning
mhm.
that, or questioning the outcome. Like what if I make the wrong choice and that means that I went about it the wrong way. I'm wondering whether my thoughts about things that affect lots of other people, or in my my role as a community role as a rabbi or whatever is different from making decisions in personal life. And I think there's a question about whether like decision is a point, a point in time kind of thing, this or that, but whether that's really a description of a moral life, because we don't so much of the show actually has been about your overall tendencies, your character traits, what we call midot in Judaism, which are revealed or which you apply or kind of bring to bear in situations, but they're not about isolated decisions. Like every time you choose to be considerate of someone is not like a specific choice that you make like from scratch each time. It's just part of a pattern of how you're living.
Mm-hmm. I wonder also as I think about this from Chidi's perspective is what does it mean to think about decisions in terms of like probabilities of outcomes and things like that? Like he just gets so swept up in the catastrophist approach. Like you can certainly imagine the cognitive behavioral therapy that he would need, that would benefit him, just as opposed to like thinking about the worst imaginable outcome of everything versus like just a process driven, well, what are the odds? What is the likelihood of each of these given outcomes, and not thinking about it in terms of the different percentages.
the there's a discussion in the episode about the gut, going by
Right.
your gut, which is
Like W.
well, I guess, but I mean that's sort of in a way that stands for something that's kind of it's not just like being impulsive or narrowing your view, but something about like you have a knowledge or an intuition of what you could do, of what your experience so far is leaning you toward, that you could rely on, so you don't have to work so hard at every single choice. Although it's interesting that he says this about choosing a soulmate, which probably is a choice. Well, I guess maybe not. I mean, that's totally not true. I guess we're going to talk about that. It's
Oh
that you
yeah,
don't.
right.
Yeah. Should we jump in?
Well, I think that there's two sources that we talked about bringing. So one, just on the issue of decisions, I'm going to share. It's from the Babylonian Talmud. It's a very famous source, actually, that's used very often in teaching about Jewish law and what the fundamental essence of this Jewish value of machloket, dispute, and so Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said for 3 years. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. And this is like the paradigmatic. There's two different approaches to the laws, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. And they said the halacha is in accordance with our opinion. The Jewish law is in accordance with our opinion. And the other side said the halacha is in accordance with our opinion. And ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, Elu ve'elu, both these and these are the words of the living God. However, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. The Talmud asks, since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were Beit Hillel privileged to have the halacha established in accordance with their opinion? And the reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, showing a restraint when affronted. And when they taught the halakha, they would teach both their own statements, they're both on their own opinions, and those of Beit Shammai. And moreover, they prioritized, meaning that they gave the opinion of Beit Shammai first. I think that this is a fascinating text to sort of bring to bear. If I wonder how Chidi would respond to it, because if you're talking about a decision in terms of like, well, we have your Beit Hillel angel on one side and your Beit Shammai angel on the other, and they're talking to you and they're kind of going back and forth, and you're thinking about all the different possible outcomes. Ultimately, there's a stated value according to Judaism to both. And not only is there a stated value, it's like the words of the living God, right? Like that both of these voices matter. And at the same time, we have to make a decision. Just because both of these are the words of the living God does not abdicate us of the responsibility of moving forward.
I love that. I love that you brought that here. I have been thinking about that particular text so much because of the tension between being open to different views and making a decision and being committed to one. And not only being open, but sort of even afterwards remaining committed to the idea that both had the words of the living God in them, even though I'm making a decision about one of them. And yet, to what you just said before, I'm thinking that it opened by saying that it took them 3 years to get to the point, of actual either
It's
discussion
true.
or deliberation to get to that. And I makes me wonder, like, what happened during those 3 years? Was it 3 years of constant, like, Chidi, like, deliberation, or was it did they talk and then they put it aside for a while, or they couldn't stand to think about it for a while, and how did they get there? No, it's very hard to hold these two things together, because I think, as I was saying before, it's much easier to think of how do we teach people to make good choices instead of bad choices, and what's that's not as hard as this, which is to help people commit themselves between two reasonably good choices, or reasonably reasonable choices.
What you just said made me also sort of think about, there is a decision hygiene process that is outlined here. We know that the halakha, the decision, is according to Beit Hillel, but the decision hygiene is that you take into consideration the alternative view and you treat it with respect, right? But ultimately, you do make the decision. And so there's something to be said for entertaining, the possibility of having your opinion be changed, be moved, and doing so with a sort of a friendly countenance. It's not the language that they use exactly, but just like the most charitable possible interpretation. And that's lifting up what is also clearly a Jewish value, is a certain level of decency and restraint.
Well, now that you're also saying that, and you mentioned Daniel Kahneman before, that this also seems like a process that generates a good, I don't want to say it as simple as like a good mood, but it's a positive way of viewing yourself, or creating positive energy in yourself while you're making a decision, which is, wow, I'm thoughtful, I'm deliberate. I actually have two worthwhile things in front of me that I could do, and if I can go over those things, I won't be dominated by feeling clutched or bad about myself for what I might do wrong. But it just creates a good environment in which to take pride in yourself, I guess, as a decider under conditions of uncertainty. And Chidi works himself into feeling so completely the opposite. In the episode, what's now I was thinking, so much of the decisions that Chidi is being described as facing are silly. Which bar they should go to after the reveal about the wedding being in a month and stuff like that. But the decision he's actually facing is like not only hard, but like harder than hard, because he's not only, like, he's in the presence of somebody else who's being asked to declare which one of these three options is his soulmate, but there's consequences. Like, for two of them there are dramatic consequences, right? One of them will go to the bad place and one of them will get to stay, and that's totally messing with his ability to kind of narrow this decision to what it should be, which is, who do I love?
So, the who do I love kind of brings us to the second source maybe that I was thinking about bringing, which is, what does Judaism in its way have to say about soulmates? And this is another classic source. I'm gonna do the best I can to sort of summarize it instead of reading it word for word. So there's a Roman woman who goes to a rabbi named Yossi ben Halafta, and she asks him, so in how many days did God create the world? And Rabbi Yossi says, in 6. So the woman asks, okay, so God created the world in 6 days. What's God been doing ever since? God is an instrument of history, or an agent in history, according to Jewish tradition. Like, this is kind of an interesting question, but Rabbi Yossi says something different. He says, God has been making matches. So the daughter of this one to that one, et cetera, et cetera. So this Roman woman says, and you believe in God for just doing that, for making matches? And she said, even I can do that. I have many slaves. This is awful. Men and women. And I can make matches for all of them for marriage. And Rabbi Yossi said, though this may be an easy thing for you to do, for God, it is difficult as splitting the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi leaves. And what does this Roman woman do? So she took her, 1,000 male slaves, her 1,000 female slaves, just lined them up and said, you marry you and you marry you, and married them off all at one night. And the next day, one slave had his head bashed in and the other lost an eye, while a third was awful because of a broken leg. And she said to them, what happened? And they each said to her, I don't want this one with whom you matched me. And immediately she summons Rabbi Yossi back and says, there is no God like your God and no Torah like your Torah, pleasing and praiseworthy, because you spoke wisely. And he said to her, didn't I tell you, if it appears to be easy in your eyes, it is difficult for the Holy One, the Holy Blessed One, as splitting the sea. So I just love this because, first of all, it's kind of like a manifestation of like that, ultimately God lives in sacred relationship. Like if we're even more expansive than just our most sacred relationships, like the people who we choose to spend our lives with and make our families with, God intervenes in our lives, or we can feel God's intervention in that love, in that relationship that we feel. And I wonder what you think of this source and sort of how it kind of applies to this concept of the soulmate that, like, I'd say The Good Place is fairly flippant about in its own way.
The soulmate idea is such a daring one for the show because it sort of sets up a lot just in terms of the ability of the show to function, I guess. It's but I actually, I have to admit, I've not been thinking about the idea of soulmates that much because we've had so much to munch on with other stuff. And I've been married as we're recording this. I'm just a couple of weeks past my 30th wedding anniversary.
And
thank you. And to a person who I think of as my soulmate. And there are so many things that, in a way, even random things that happened in order for us to come together, happenstance things in our lives, things that made it possible for us to be in the same place and continue to be in the same place for our relationship to germinate. And not to mention I want to be Chidi-like and go back into history as to things that the truth is, if it hadn't been for Hitler and the Nazis, right, we wouldn't be together, and for all kinds of things in our personal stories. And I know that the version of myself that exists now, who I am and how I am, is entirely wrapped up with the fact that I married Lori. And I remember early on, we were in college when we met, and in a way there was a little bit of choice. In fact, I think about, I was actually, the person I was standing next to at the moment I met Lori, or Lori was introduced to me, was right in my head over the few days. This is the beginning of my junior year of college. Someone I was also thinking of asking out, and it was very clear to me that deciding which of these women to pursue represented two very
moments in your
it was
life.
Totally a cheating. It wasn't cheating moment in my life. It would have been two totally different. Two different people, and it would have been different relationships, and more so, it would have been different versions of myself that would have emerged out of that. So I don't spend at any time at all really thinking about, is this version of me? I'm very delighted. I am more than delighted. I can't imagine anything other than the choice that I made. The other thing is that it's so many years later, and I'm now more than twice as old as I was when this, choice of destiny, which was obviously a choice that two people had to make, to affirm that. And, but how could we possibly have seen what would emerge out of our lives, what our lives would become? The other thing is, though, as a person who performs marriages, and you and I were just talking about this a few days ago.
Right.
Yeah, we were. That it makes me really nervous. I used to recite this story that you talked about all the time at sort of the beginning ceremonies before weddings, the ketubah signing, where people start to get together and sort of segue from the chaos of wedding days into the ceremony. And but I'm also conscious that, like, I never know when I'm about to marry someone whether in fact they found their soulmate. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who I was pretty convinced that when I did their wedding, and he was my one of my close friends, that that things were going to be great, and they're divorced, and it has not been good. Yeah, it makes me really nervous to kind of quote that story and say it about somebody else. How about you? How do you think about this?
What you just said kind of makes me think about according. I brought up like the data. And one of the things I try not to think about when I'm sitting across from a wedding couple is that, if you just take the outside view and look at the odds in American society writ large, you're sitting across from a 50-50 shot. So that's something that strikes me. But I would say that, I sort of think about the same thing. So I also consider Jade, my wife, to be my soulmate. And I think about the array of circumstances that kind of lined up for us to meet each other, and sort of feeling potentially some divine intervention there that, allowed that relationship to blossom. Of course, in Jerusalem of all places, when we were both with the
Ah,
students there, it's right. Like, it's like, that's especially beautiful in its own way. I think that when I had a wonderful teacher named Rabbi Jan Katsu who points out, I don't think I've met Lori, but I'm sure that if I met her, I would find her to be, all kinds of wonderful and be able to name wonderful traits about her. And if I asked you about her, you'd be able to name all kinds of wonderful things about her. And, if you met Jade, I, be able to say all kinds of wonderful things about her. And at the same time, in spite of our ability to name these wonderful things about these other people, we wouldn't have the same, I wouldn't be able to have the same kind of relationship that you do with Lori, and you wouldn't have the same kind of relationship that I do with Jade. And that there's something that goes beyond just these listing of characteristics that, allows for the depth of our relationships, for that sanctity. And I'm kind of thinking about that moment when Eleanor is listing all the things about Chidi that drive her nuts. And then she says, "Oh my God, I'm in love with Chidi."
yeah.
And like, there's something much more real about that. And ultimately, like, spoiler alert, we know what kind of becomes of their relationship, which is a beautiful thing. And that's in its own way truer than, said kind of the superficial things that Tahani is kind of thinking about. And also Tahani thinks that Chidi loves her, which is like just a completely other,
Yes.
it was just complete, it's like, I just was trying to, kind of process the romantic comedy elements of this particular episode, because it was, just so it was, we could probably go through, several of those 200,000, different poems, things that Janet said, and try and figure out what allusions are being made across, across fictional time and space. Yeah, in addition to being very much about like weighing our choices, I thought that this episode was very much about how we think about what it means to love someone and to be loved. Yeah.
I mean, there's some really wonderfully nuanced things that are said in these moments of romantic comedy. I think at the end where both Eleanor and Tahani are describing why they don't think that Chidi is their soulmate, even though later on we're going to see that Eleanor and Chidi really are. And Eleanor, I think, says something like, "Not so much hot for teacher, but eternally grateful," and then something about him being surprisingly ripped. And so
Right. Yeah.
there's attraction, but also like she's sort of reflecting on their relationship, and Tahani's thing about, I think she says that, that we're the only highly educated sophisticates, in the place, and she might have been duped by that. And then they both look at Jason and Janet as in this moment as having like a true love for each other. Like that seems to be the one thing that everybody looks at and says like this seems to work. They seem to belong. And an argument for simplicity, for as you say, not thinking of it as a list of characteristics, but there's a basic kindness. Even though Janet's not aware, I guess, or not yet. The next episode, there's a bunch of great stuff, which Janet attempts to explain why it's okay for her to be with Jason.
So there's one other thing I just want to offer about, in talking about the Midrash against, in conversation with the Good Place, which is like the setup of the Good Place is that, whoever is making the decision is the Roman woman, right? Who has like said like, okay, I'm going to make these two people soulmates. And ultimately, as you mentioned, we know where Chidi and Eleanor are headed. And at the same time, Eleanor leaves this episode not believing that that's the direction they're headed. And the Midrash doesn't describe the mechanism by which God makes these matches. But one could imagine, and in particular, as you think about its comparison to splitting the Red Sea, that there's an element of wandering and wilderness and journey as part of it. And that part of what actually ends up making Chidi and Eleanor's relationship work is their shared experiences, is the journey that they go on together. And that if they didn't do that, they wouldn't be able to arrive at the place where they really are, in fact, soulmates.
I think, you and I think are both the kind of people who think about the range of types of relationships that there are
Yeah.
that are deep and profound, and soulmate is a lot to lay on top of that for people.
Yeah.
And not so much that I don't think that it's hard to imagine that two people could become soulmates who fall in love and have many layers to their relationship. I think what's probably hard is the idea that there could only have been that one person in the universe for you.
Mm.
And I mean, I've known people who, and I think particularly now in my current work in a congregation for the first time these past 13 years, that seeing people who are married for a second time and talk about how both of the marriages were good. Maybe they lost their first spouse um, to illness, and they were in love and they were soulmates. And this next one, if they don't use, I mean, nobody ever used that word soulmates to me, but it's possible to find this kind of deep and profound love again, which I think is interesting. So I don't have trouble, I think, with the concept of soulmate as a description of a an ideal, not maybe ideal is the wrong word, but a kind of beautiful relationship. I just wonder whether the idea that there is one soulmate that you had to find, because the odds of your finding that person are so small. And I think also I probably also wrapped up with my own um, guilt that I found someone, and that person has, it turned out to be such a good choice and has led me to so many good things, um, and uh, and how much I wish for so many of the other people around me who are married and in tough situations, not just bad marriages, but just really working hard on marriage issues that or not even not right. We're in an age where people are together, but they're not necessarily married. But people working on couple issues who struggle much more, and I feel like who deserve just as much as I do to have the many layers of a soulmate like relationship.
Mm, mm. I'm not pro marriage. I'm pro sacred relationships, however you find them. And that, ultimately a lesson of both the midrash and the show is that goodness and godliness and sort of like, not godliness is a charged term, I would say. The depths and heights of human experience occur when we're in relationship with other people. I wave my hand here as an introvert among you and stuff like that. And yet both the data and the wisdom of tradition show that when in doubt, connect with people. When in doubt, connect with people.
It seems like in the trajectory of the show that there are these two relationships that are held out as very special, one of them being Eleanor and Chidi, and the other being Janet and Jason.
Yeah.
And one is, Janet and Jason are built on this simplicity of kindness. Jason is a very pure soul who, as we've talked about, he has this concept of himself, of the life he deserves to live. And I think he says this to Janet too, like somehow he's going to be the one who shows her is the path to the life that she deserves to live. And you think, well, how is that possible? She's a completely all-knowing
Right.
being who's also programmed, as I think she says, to be kind and helpful to everybody already. But she somehow sees that there's a piece of her all-knowingness and even her good-naturedness, which is missing, that somehow he adds, and there's no question that there's growth that happens because of that. And it's funny because nobody says, I don't remember, my parents never sat down and said, when you're looking for someone, like, make sure that's a person you think can help you grow. I don't think that was ever a language that we talk about. Nor do I think, actually, as I'm thinking about it now, I don't think that's a conversation I've had with couples getting married either. Obviously, Eleanor and Chidi become that for each other. They help each other, in specific ways, and in what's kind of their basic soul program where they need to grow. We were talking, so you and I were talking a few days ago about what is it that we do when we meet a couple who we're going to officiate at their wedding. Is there anything like that you probe with people? Like, is this someone, how does this person help you grow or learn?
So my primary process for preparations leading towards a wedding, I actually learned from my teacher, Rabbi Nancy Weiner, who, I learned it simultaneously while she was leading my wife and I through the process herself, because she was one of the two officiants at our wedding, is to do a timeline of the relationship. and sort of talk about how growth plays a part of that a part of their journey towards the chuppah, instead of talking sort of directly about it, which is a great question, by the way, that I might have to now incorporate into my quiver. We sort of live it out and talk about their relationship from its beginning to the present moment, and then where it's going to go and where they're hoping it'll go.
So nervous about trying to like encapsulate this soulmate discussion in one conversation with you, one podcast, for fear of somehow getting it wrong.
We're gonna have a lot of time to talk about it, John. I mean, it's gonna come up. I mean, it's like, it's gonna not rear its ugly head, rear its beautiful head constantly. It's gonna be a theme that we, circle back to. And there's other sources that can sort of speak to these questions for sure. In Jewish tradition.
Well, I would like to think that my spouse is someone who, if she was attempting to feed me cake and I couldn't figure out how to eat it, I'm trying to think. I have my table manners have definitely improved, I think, over the years, but there are things. Well, thanks, Dan. Great to talk to you again, and looking forward to us picking up in one of the future episodes.
Thanks so much, John. Always a pleasure.
And that's a wrap on the 10th episode of Tove. Thanks for coming this far with us. We're working on something extra special for the end of Season 1. Stay tuned. If we've helped you think about something or just made you smile, give us a good rating and share Tove with others. I'm John Spira-Savet, and I'm at RabbiJS3. And Dan Ross is on Instagram with his wittily named Jewish-themed workout videos at RAV_WOD. If you want to be in touch with questions or ideas, email me at tove@tovegoodplace.com. That's the website, by the way, where you can find show notes, deeper dives, and a lexicon of terms like Talmud and Midrash. Thank you again for listening, and go learn more about something good.
Bum, 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 bum.